I don't talk about what happened overseas much. Not to anyone. I don't even know why I'm writing this now. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's fear that I need to get out of my system. Or maybe it's because I want to warn someone. Anyone. When we were deployed, it was supposed to be a quick mission: go in, secure the area, and get out. Nothing more than routine. It was a small, war-torn country in the middle of nowhere, one you'd never heard of. I sure as hell hadn't. Our unit, led by Captain Mike Holloway, had done this kind of thing before. Mike was a real hard-ass, the kind of guy who didn't flinch, even when things got ugly. And they got ugly pretty fast. The people in that village weren't armed. Not most of them, anyway. Just farmers, shopkeepers, women, and kids. But we weren't there to ask questions. We had orders, and we followed them. Or at least, most of us did. There were some guys, Tom, Jack, and a few others, who took things a step further. Too far, if you ask me. I'll spare you the details, but things happened that shouldn't have. Things I regret not stopping. Then there was her. We'd heard rumors. Villagers talked about a woman who lived just outside the village, deep in the woods. They said she wasn't normal, that she could do things, summon things. A witch, some of them called her. Of course, no one believed that crap, least of all Mike. He was all about results, not superstition. But one day, when we were doing a sweep through a cluster of houses, we found her. She was standing in the doorway of this old, crumbling hut. Small, wiry, with these dark eyes that seemed to look right through you. Her face was emotionless, but there was something about her that made my skin crawl. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, watching as we pulled her husband out. He was older, a man in his 60s maybe. They tried to resist when the others dragged him out, screaming something in their language that I didn't understand. The next thing I knew, Jack raised his rifle and, well, the shot echoed through the air. And then it happened. That woman, the witch, she didn't cry or scream. She just stood there, staring at Jack. Her eyes never left him, not even as her husband's body hit the ground. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, colder. For a second, it felt like everything went silent, like the world was holding its breath. Mike ordered us to move on, but the way that woman stared at us, it did something to me. I didn't say anything, but I could feel it in my gut that we'd made a huge mistake. After that, things started getting weird. We finished the sweep, but the whole time, it felt like we were being watched. Not by the villagers, they had all scattered by then, but by something else. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees, hearing whispers that didn't seem to come from anyone. I wasn't the only one either. Tom, usually the toughest guy in the squad, said he felt it too. Like we weren't alone. That night, we camped just outside the village. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the wind, whispering through the trees like it was carrying voices. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my nerves, but deep down I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until the next morning that the real terror began. The next morning, the camp felt strange. I woke up covered in a cold sweat, though the air was stifling. The whole place had a thick, humid heaviness to it. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Mike was up before anyone else, pacing around like he had an itch he couldn't scratch. He didn't say much, but I could tell something had gotten to him. It wasn't long before we noticed someone was missing. Jack. His gear was still there, but his sleeping bag was empty. At first, we thought he'd wandered off to take a piss, but when 20 minutes passed and there was still no sign of him, Mike sent us to fan out and look. We found him about half a mile away, near the tree line. He was lying face down in the dirt, his rifle just out of reach. I was one of the first to get there, and the second I saw him, I knew he was dead. His skin was pale, like all the blood had been drained from his body. But it was his face that haunted me the most. His eyes were wide open, frozen in this look of sheer terror, like he'd seen something so horrible that it killed him right where he stood. Tom was the one who rolled him over. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Just that look on his face, like death had reached out and claimed him in the middle of the night. Mike tried to radio for backup, but the signal was nothing but static. That was the first real sign that something was seriously wrong. Mike was shaken, but he tried to keep it together. "It's probably heat stroke or something," he said, though we all knew that didn't make sense. It hadn't been hot enough for that, and Jack was one of the strongest guys in the squad. There was no way he'd go down like that. We buried Jack in a shallow grave under the trees. It didn't feel right, but we couldn't just leave him there in the open. While we dug, the air seemed to grow thicker, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves overhead. It sounded like voices, faint and distant, but always there. After we buried Jack, things went downhill fast. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. It wasn't just the wind. They were voices, soft but insistent, calling out from somewhere deep in the woods. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening as the voices seemed to move closer. And then there were the dreams. We all had them. I don't know if it was the guilt from what we did or something else, but that night, every single one of us dreamed about the same thing, the witch. She was standing in the middle of the village, her black eyes staring into us. In the dream, she didn't move, didn't speak, but you could feel her anger. It was like she was reaching out for us, pulling us toward her. I woke up gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked around, I could see the same terror in the eyes of the others. The next morning, Mike was on edge. He was usually the one to keep his cool, but after what happened to Jack, something had shifted in him. He barked orders at us to pack up and get moving. "We're heading back," he said, his voice tense. "We'll regroup with the others, get some reinforcements out here." No one argued. We all wanted to get the hell out of there. But the land seemed to shift as we marched. The trails we had come down were no longer clear. Every path we took seemed to twist and loop back on itself. The forest was dense, far denser than we remembered. It was like it was closing in on us, cutting off every exit. The deeper we went, the more we felt like we were walking in circles. And the whispers followed us. By midday, it became clear we were lost. The maps made no sense, and the compass spun uselessly. Mike tried to keep control, but you could see the cracks starting to show. The radio still wasn't working, and the air felt thicker by the minute, like we were being suffocated by something we couldn't see. Then we lost Tom. It happened so fast. 1 second, he was right in front of us, and the next, he was gone. Vanished into thin air. We didn't hear him scream. We didn't hear anything. One moment he was there, and the next, there was just empty space. We searched for hours, shouting his name, but there was no sign of him. Mike insisted we push on, said Tom would find his way back to us. But none of us believed that. Not really. We were all thinking the same thing, whatever had taken Jack had gotten Tom too. We set up camp again that night, even though none of us wanted to stop. The forest was too dark, too silent, and the voices, those damned whispers, were louder than ever. They circled us as we huddled around the small fire, and this time, we could almost make out what they were saying. It was her. The witch. Her voice was woven into the whispers, calling out to us, taunting us. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. I felt like she was standing right behind me, her cold breath on the back of my neck. But every time I turned, there was nothing there. Just shadows. And then, in the middle of the night, I heard it. A scream. Not a distant, panicked shout, but something much closer. Raw and full of pain. It was Tom's voice. But when we rushed toward the sound, there was nothing there. Just an empty stretch of woods, and the faint rustling of the leaves, as if they were laughing at us. We didn't sleep that night. Not a single one of us. We just sat there, staring into the dark, waiting for whatever was out there to come for us next. We didn't sleep that night. I mean, how could we? It felt like the darkness itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the next moment to strike. We sat there, around the fire, trying to act like everything was fine, but no one could hide the fear anymore. Not even Mike. By dawn, we decided we couldn't stay in the forest another minute. We had to move, even if we were lost. Mike kept saying we'd find the road eventually, that we just needed to keep going. But his voice lacked the confidence it used to have. He was scared too. We all were. It wasn't just the fact that Tom had vanished or that Jack was dead. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at our guts and made our skin crawl. Every step we took, it felt like we were being watched, but not in the normal sense. It was like something was right behind us, brushing against our backs, but whenever we looked, there was nothing there. Just the endless, tangled woods. By mid-afternoon, the air grew thick again, humid and choking. The trees, which had seemed so dense before, now felt like they were shifting. Every time we glanced at them, they seemed closer, like the forest itself was closing in on us. The path twisted and turned, but no matter how far we walked, we never seemed to get anywhere. That's when we found the first sign. It was a small wooden charm, hanging from a tree. At first, I thought it was some kind of ancient wind chime, but when I looked closer, I realized it was something much darker. It was a crudely made figure, woven together with sticks and bones, hanging from a thin piece of twine. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't like the way it made me feel. The others noticed it too. Even Mike looked uneasy. "I don't like this," Emily said, her voice trembling. She hadn't said much since Jack died. Now, she couldn't take her eyes off that thing hanging from the tree. "We need to keep moving," Mike said, his voice shaky but firm. He reached up, yanked the charm down, and tossed it into the bushes like it was nothing. But I could see it in his eyes, he was just as rattled as the rest of us. That's when the smell hit us. It was faint at first, like something sour on the breeze, but it grew stronger the further we went. It was rancid, like rotting meat mixed with burning hair. The others started noticing too. Emily covered her nose, and Tom, who had been mostly silent since that night, whispered, "What the hell is that?" We followed the smell, and soon enough, we found its source. There, half buried under a pile of leaves and mud, was what was left of Tom. Or at least, it looked like Tom. His body was twisted, mangled in ways that didn't make sense, like something had grabbed him and squeezed until his bones shattered. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring up at the sky, frozen in terror. The worst part? There wasn't a single drop of blood. Not anywhere. It was like he had been drained dry, left there as a message. Emily screamed, but the rest of us just stood there, stunned into silence. Even Mike didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at Tom's body, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. I don't know who spoke first, but eventually, someone whispered, "We need to get out of here." Mike shook his head, trying to regain control. "We'll move on," he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. "We'll leave him. There's nothing we can do for him now." But before we could take a single step, the wind picked up, and those whispers came back. This time, though, they weren't distant. They were right there with us, circling us, coming from every direction at once. The trees rustled and swayed as if they were alive, and the air grew colder. "She's here," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how she knew, but she was right. The wind howled, and through the gaps in the trees, we caught glimpses of movement. At first, it was just shadows, flitting between the trunks, but then, I saw her. Just for a second, but it was enough to send ice down my spine. She was standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden by the darkness. The witch. Her eyes, those cold, black eyes, were locked on us, unblinking. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared, like she was daring us to take one more step. Mike saw her too. His face went pale, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "We need to move," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." We didn't argue. We ran. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like hours. The trees blurred past us, and those whispers followed us, growing louder and louder. It felt like they were inside our heads, crawling under our skin. No matter how fast we ran, no matter how far we went, we couldn't shake the feeling that she was right behind us, reaching out with those cold, dead hands. By the time we stopped, it was almost dark. We were breathless, drenched in sweat, and completely lost. That's when we heard the screams. It wasn't far, maybe a few 100 feet away, deeper in the trees. We recognized the voice immediately. It was Mike. But the thing is, Mike was standing right next to us. When we heard the scream, every hair on my body stood on end. It wasn't just any scream, it was Mike's voice, raw and full of terror. But the real Mike, the one I could see with my own eyes, was standing right next to me. His face drained of color, and for the first time, I saw him unravel. His hands shook as he fumbled for his rifle, his eyes wide with confusion. What the hell is that?" he whispered, but no one answered. We were too stunned. I mean, what could you say when you hear your own voice screaming from somewhere deep in the woods? The scream came again, closer this time, ripping through the silence of the forest. It sounded like something was being torn apart, and even though I knew it wasn't possible, every instinct in me told me it was Mike. The same Mike who was standing beside me, as solid as anyone. "We need to go now," Emily said, her voice trembling. She wasn't just scared anymore, she was on the verge of breaking down. Mike, usually the one to give orders, just stood there frozen, staring into the woods. His face was white as a ghost. Whatever was happening, it had finally gotten to him. I reached out and grabbed his arm. "We have to move, Mike," I said, shaking him hard. "We can't stay here." He nodded, though his eyes were still locked on the trees, where the scream had come from. His voice was barely audible when he muttered, "She's playing with us." We didn't know what direction to go anymore. Every step we took, it felt like we were wandering deeper into the witch's grasp. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the branches twisting and creaking like bones bending under pressure. The air was thick with the smell of earth and rot, and those whispers, they never stopped. But it wasn't until we heard the laughter that the real terror began. It started soft, almost like it was carried by the wind. But as we walked, it grew louder, clearer, until it surrounded us. It wasn't a normal laugh either. It was high-pitched, broken, like something that had forgotten how to sound human. Emily was the first to see them. We just stepped into a small clearing when she gasped, pointing with a trembling hand. There, hanging from the low branches of a dead tree, were more of those twisted, bone-and-stick charms. Dozens of them. They clattered together in the wind, producing this eerie rattling sound, but that wasn't what stopped us in our tracks. Among the charms, hanging just above eye level, was a figure, a man. At first, I thought it was a corpse, but then I realized what it was. It was another one of those charms, only this one was larger, human-shaped, and it looked eerily like Jack. Whoever, or whatever, had made it had done it with sickening precision. The figure was crudely woven with branches, but its face, made from a carved piece of wood, had Jack's features. Even his dog tags hung from its neck. Emily backed away, her hand over her mouth, but the rest of us couldn't take our eyes off it. "What the hell is this?" Tom muttered, his voice thick with dread. Mike stepped forward, his face blank, as if he was trying to make sense of it. He reached up, about to pull the thing down, when suddenly the laughter stopped. And the forest went silent. We didn't have time to react before something slammed into Mike. 1 second he was standing there, and the next, he was flying backward, crashing into the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of him. I rushed to his side, but before I could even reach him, the air around us turned cold, bone-chilling cold. And then she appeared. The witch. She stepped out from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, her body barely more than a silhouette in the dim light, but there was no mistaking her. Her black eyes gleamed in the fading light, her face twisted into a mask of hatred. Her clothes were tattered, her long hair matted with dirt and blood. She looked like she had crawled out of the earth itself. Mike scrambled to his feet, his rifle raised, but before he could fire, she lifted her hand, and he froze. Completely. He couldn't move, couldn't even speak. I could see the panic in his eyes, the fear that washed over him as he tried to resist whatever invisible force was holding him in place. "She's got him!" Emily screamed. But there was nothing we could do. The witch's lips moved silently, as though she was chanting something, and then Mike started to scream. Not from pain, but from something worse. It was like he was being consumed from the inside. His eyes rolled back, and his skin turned pale, just like Jack's. In less than a minute, he collapsed, lifeless. Dead. None of us could speak. The witch turned her gaze toward us, her eyes burning with a fury that chilled my soul. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I felt my legs lock up with fear. This was it, I thought. We were next. But then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. Melted into the shadows, leaving nothing but the bone-chilling cold and the sound of Mike's lifeless body collapsing in the dirt. We stood there for what felt like forever, too shocked to move. Mike, our leader, the toughest guy I knew, was gone. Just like that. Killed without a single touch. Emily was shaking, tears running down her face, but there was no time for grief. No time to think. I grabbed her arm and Tom's, pulling them both toward the edge of the clearing. "We have to go." "Now," I said, my voice cracking. Tom nodded, his face pale, but he didn't say a word. He just followed, stumbling as we pushed through the thick undergrowth, trying to get as far from that clearing as possible. We didn't know where we were going anymore. We didn't care. We just needed to get away. As we ran, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees twisting and reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to grab us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the cold, it followed us, like the witch was just behind us, stalking us through the trees. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually, we stumbled upon a road. An actual road. It was like some kind of miracle after everything we'd been through. Emily dropped to her knees, sobbing in relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe yet. Tom was the first to speak. "Do you think it's over?" I didn't answer him. I didn't want to lie. We didn't stop running until we found an outpost a few miles down the road. We burst in, covered in mud and blood, babbling about what had happened. The officers there listened, but I could see it in their eyes, they didn't believe us. Who would? They sent out a search party, but of course, they didn't find anything. No bodies. No witch. Nothing. Just an empty clearing and a shallow grave where Jack had been buried. The rest of the unit thought we'd gone crazy, that the jumble had gotten to us. But we knew. We knew the truth. The witch wasn't finished. After we got back to the outpost, things should have felt safer. We were in the middle of military grounds, surrounded by other soldiers, behind fences, and miles from the village. But it didn't feel right. It never did. Tom, Emily, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, still waiting for the right moment. The officers dismissed our story, calling it the effects of trauma or the stress of combat. They put us on rest duty, telling us we'd been through a lot and just needed time to cool off. Mike's death had hit us hard. We knew the truth. The way he died, she wasn't done with us. The fear that had frozen him, none of us could stop seeing it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Pale. Terrified. Drained. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The first night back, none of us slept. We were all scattered in different rooms at the outpost, but we had the same dream. It was the witch, of course. She was in the village again, standing over the graves we dug, her face twisted with fury. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had something with her, Mike. His dead eyes stared back at us, his mouth hanging open like he was silently screaming, his skin ashen. She was controlling him, manipulating him like a puppet, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were fixed right on me. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When I found Tom and Emily the next morning, their faces told me they'd seen the same thing. We didn't even need to talk about it. A few days passed, and things only got worse. Emily started acting strange. She was jumpy, paranoid. She wouldn't leave her room, and when she did, she kept saying she could feel her, feel the witch, even though we were miles away. She swore she saw shadows following her in the mirrors, and every time she was alone, she heard whispers, the same whispers we'd heard back in the woods. Tom was holding it together better than Emily, but I could tell it was getting to him too. He barely spoke. He spent most of his time staring out at the jungle, like he was waiting for something to come crawling out of the trees. Then, one night, Emily snapped. I was lying in bed, trying to force myself to sleep, when I heard the screaming. It was coming from Emily's room. I jumped up, ran down the hallway, and found her door locked from the inside. I banged on it, calling her name, but all I could hear was her terrified voice screaming, "She's here! She's here!" By the time I managed to kick the door open, it was too late. Emily was on the floor, curled into a ball, her body trembling violently. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't focused on anything. She was muttering something under her breath, over and over, but I couldn't make out the words. When I knelt beside her, she grabbed my arm with a strength that shocked me. Her fingers dug into my skin, and she whispered, "She's in my head. She's not done." We called for a medic, but it didn't matter. Emily was gone, trapped in some nightmare that we couldn't pull her out of. They took her away, saying she was suffering from severe trauma, but we knew better. Tom and I were the only ones left. "I think we need to go back," Tom said one night, after a long stretch of silence. We'd barely spoken since Emily had been taken. His eyes were hollow, his voice flat. "She's not going to stop. Not until we're all dead." I didn't want to believe him, but I knew he was right. The witch wasn't going to let us go. She had taken Jack, Tom, Mike, and now Emily. We were next. It was only a matter of time. And if we didn't go back to that cursed place, she'd find us, one by one, no matter where we were. The decision to return wasn't easy, but it felt inevitable. We didn't tell anyone what we were doing. We didn't need permission. We knew what we had to do. The village looked the same as when we left it, though somehow the air felt even heavier. It was silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not welcome. Like the place itself wanted to swallow us whole. The moment we stepped back into the clearing, I could feel the weight of the witch's presence pressing down on us. We made our way to the spot where it had all started, where we had killed her husband. The hut was still there, as decayed and crumbling as before. I could feel her anger in the air, like a storm building on the horizon. "This is where it ends," Tom muttered, though I wasn't sure if he believed it. We didn't have a plan. There was nothing we could do but stand there, waiting. And she came, just like we knew she would. She emerged from the trees, her face twisted into that same expression of hate and fury. The air around us grew colder, and the wind picked up, swirling leaves and dust around us like we were in the eye of a storm. Her eyes locked on us, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of something else. Pain. Loss. Grief. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by raw, burning hatred. I don't know what I expected her to do, but when she raised her hand, I felt something cold settle deep in my bones. It was like death itself had reached out and grabbed hold of me, squeezing the life from my body. I could barely breathe. Tom let out a strangled cry, dropping to his knees beside me. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror. "She's killing us," he rasped. "She's killing us." I could feel the life draining out of me, inch by inch, and I knew this was it. There was no escape. But then I remembered something that had been gnawing at the back of my mind ever since we came back. It wasn't just about the men she had killed. It wasn't about the soldiers. It was about her husband. I don't know why, but in that moment, I forced myself to speak. My voice was weak, barely a whisper, but I managed to say the words. "We're sorry. We're sorry for what we did. For what we took from you." The wind stopped. The cold pressure around my body loosened, just a fraction, and the witch's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, her gaze burning into me. Sorry? Her voice was sharp, bitter. You're sorry? Tom was struggling to breathe beside me, but I pressed on. We didn't know. We didn't know what he meant to you. What we were doing. We were following orders. Please. Her face twisted, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tear us apart right there. But then, slowly, her hand lowered. You took everything from me, she hissed, her voice filled with an old, aching sorrow. Now you must carry that weight. The pressure lifted completely, and I could breathe again. Tom gasped, collapsing to the ground in a heap. The witch stood there for a moment longer, her eyes full of fury, but also something else, something I couldn't quite place. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Vanished into the trees, leaving us alone in the silence. We didn't stick around. We grabbed Tom and ran, not stopping until we were far from that cursed village. We survived. But we were never the same. Tom was a broken man after that. He never recovered, not really. We stayed in touch for a while, but eventually, he disappeared. No one's heard from him since. As for me, I don't talk about what happened. Not to anyone. But I still see her in my dreams sometimes. Standing at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that one day she'll come for me again. Because you can't run from the weight of what you've done.